Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lectures on the Stranger. We have reached part 2, and we're going to cover chapters 1 through 3 in this lecture, and the end of the book in the next lecture. So let's get started. Chapter 1. Let's look at some characters first. We have some new characters. First, we have the examining magistrate. Now, I'm not an expert in French legislative policy or courtrooms, but I do know that the examining magistrate is sort of like a judge or an official who comes in to question Meursault after he commits his crime. So this particular person is really, really disturbed by Meursault's lack of grief over his mother's death. In fact, it gets to a point that you may remember that he pulls out a crucifix, waves it around at Meursault, and demands to know whether he believes in God. Because he thinks Meursault is this cold, heartless atheist, pretty much. And Meursault, who doesn't see a problem with being a cold, heartless atheist, says, "Yes, I don't believe in God," and the magistrate freaks out. We also have the prosecutor. So this lawyer argues against Meursault at the trial. He, as most of the characters in this book who are judging Meursault, he judges him based on his character, more so than for the crime that he committed. So he's looking at Meursault as cool, calculating, a monster. He's using, as other people during the trial do, Meursault's lack of emotional attachment to his mother as evidence for reasoning for the crime, which is something that we often do as people. We try and go back to the source and figure out, what is the mindset of the killer. But we have to be careful because we know also that Meursault's relationship with his mother is complex and quite possibly not directly related to his crime. One of the most intense accusations or conclusions that the prosecutor comes to is that he believes that Meursault's moral indifference is a threat to society. So the fact that Meursault doesn't believe in the same morals or follow the same patterns as other people is a reason for him to be killed, removed. Then we have the chaplain. So this man's job, at least in the context of prison, is to come in and talk to the prisoners and help them get good with God when they're in prison, especially the ones who are on death row. So this priest comes in to talk to Meursault. Meursault rejects him quite a bit. He doesn't want to talk to him. And after Meursault is found guilty, the chaplain continues to try and see him, and he keeps visiting and he keeps visiting. And then he starts to demand that Meursault needs to take this opportunity to take comfort in God. At the same time, even though the chaplain is very demanding, he is threatened by Meursault. He becomes very emotional when talking to Meursault because Meursault completely rejects his point of view. In fact, the chaplain feels like his beliefs are threatened by Meursault's indifference and stubbornness. Meursault eventually can't handle this conflict anymore. He's dealing with imprisonment and potentially the end of his life. And he becomes enraged and yells at the chaplain, saying life is meaningless, all men are condemned to die, basically asserting this sort of dark but existential perspective. Okay, so chapter 1, I made this very brief. Meursault is arrested and his trial begins. And let's look at some quotations. Then he wanted to know if I hired an attorney. I admitted I hadn't and inquired whether it was really necessary to have one. Why do you ask? He said. I said I thought my case was pretty simple. He smiled and said, That's your opinion, but the law is the law. If you don't hire an attorney yourself, the court will appoint one. I thought that it was very convenient that the court should take care of those details. I told him so. He agreed with me and concluded that it was a good law. I chose this because it shows Meursault's attitude toward his situation. In his eyes, this is a very simple trial because he doesn't see it as a trial of morality or a social demonstration. But to the people outside, they think, oh, this is into the mind of a killer. Let's figure out who this guy is. This is going to be very complex. So because he isn't psychologically reflective, he doesn't see this as complicated, and this might be part of his downfall, that he is so, as usual, so much an observer and so disconnected. And again, that sense of being an outsider, an observer, disconnected even from his own fate. He says, I had read descriptions of scenes like this in books, and it all seemed like a game to me. Many of us, I'm sure, have felt this feeling where you are going through something so surreal that it doesn't feel like it's of any consequence. One of the examples I can think of is if you've had to go grocery shopping lately. If you're watching this in the beginning of 2020, people are wearing masks, people are wearing strange headgear and medical gloves in the grocery store. You're worried about standing too close to other people. You're worried about getting the things that you need. Your reality has changed so much. Just like Meursault's reality has changed from being a free man to being a man on trial. And the world almost seems to be working without you. And it's very strange and surreal. So in a certain way, this is an emotional reaction. But in another way, it's a demonstration of Meursault's lack of responsibility when it comes to his involvement in the outside world. On my way out, I was even going to shake his hand, but just in time I remembered that I had killed a man. And I think this speaks to similar issues here. That Meursault sees this as a game. And in fact, maybe in a sense it is a game. The game that it is. There's all these rules. There are all these procedures. There are human beings who play certain roles. I mean, this is starting to sound like some sort of fancy tabletop game. This is a Dungeons and Dragons situation. Surreal people playing roles, certain goals, certain outcomes. And he's almost seeing this guy just as a human being. He's not seeing the game of the criminal justice system for the reality that people treat it as. All right. I chose these quotations to point out even more, because this is a very important theme in the book, or important sequence of events, you could say. The focus of the trial is not on Meursault's actions on the beach. Just like the reader can't get much out of that, neither can the judge and jury. Neither can the prosecutor or the defense. So they're focusing on Meursault's psychological condition. Right at the beginning, his lawyer sits down and explains that there had been some investigations into Meursault's private life. Then he starts asking questions about the day of Meursault's mother's funeral. So we cycle back to the beginning of the book. And most importantly, he asked if I had felt any sadness that day. That's the quotation. So they are not looking at Meursault's actions, they are looking at his internal workings to see if he's feeling the right emotions, if he's feeling things that appear to be normal, because they're going to evaluate his mental state and use that to prosecute him. Now, this is a very complicated issue. Of course, it's important what mental state someone is in, especially when they commit a crime. And yet, at the same time, it begs the question, are we putting a person on trial for their actions, for their crime? Or are we putting them on trial for who they are as a person? And then if that is the question, then who has the right to decide the answer? Because law is a governmental institution. It's also a social institution. Morality is a personal issue, but it's also a social issue, especially, and then it's a government issue if you have a criminal justice system. So this is a major question in the book that the answer that the French people give in this book is that whoever has the power of might, which in this case is the social structure and the government, that's who's right. So the lawyers, the judge, the jury, they get to decide what is morally correct because they have power. And Meursault does not try to play any games to save himself. He admits, and I'm going to read it here, "Nevertheless, I had answered that I had pretty much lost the habit of analyzing myself, and that it was hard for me to tell him what he wanted to know. I probably did love Maman, but that didn't mean anything. At one time or another, all normal people have wished their loved ones were dead." Here the lawyer interrupted me, and he seemed very upset. Meursault tells the truth, and the truth is uncomfortable, it's dark, it does not go along with the proper narrative that you want to hear from someone who killed someone. You want to hear them apologizing, you want to hear them feeling sorry, you want to hear that they love their families, that they seem somewhat normal, and maybe they just had a lapse in judgment. But this guy does not seem that way, and that's problematic for him. He thought for a minute. He asked me if he could say that day I had held back my natural feelings. I said no, because it's not true. He gave me a strange look, as if he found me slightly disgusting. So, I want to remind you, because it is somewhat, it's easy to condemn Meursault in this situation. I want to remind you that what he did, we have no proof that it really was premeditated, and that there's still gray areas, even if you are horrified by him, there's still gray areas of morality here, because we don't really know, we're not talking about what he did, we're only talking about his relationship with his mother. And that does not necessarily have anything to do with his actions on the beach, although it might. Again, these are gray areas, so there's a little bit of everything going on here, and I want you to make your own choices when it comes to analyzing this character. And again, this continues the thread. He didn't understand me, and he was sort of holding it against me. I felt the urge to reassure him that I was like everybody else, just like everybody else, but really there wasn't much point, and I gave up the idea out of laziness. So Meursault here is a little self-reflective, and he thinks that he is like everybody else. We all have complex relationships with our parents. We all have strange emotions. We all have impulses. But he knows that it doesn't sound good, that the narrative that this man has created for him, that the judges and the jury are going to create for him, are not in his favor. And there you have it. It's not what interests me is what you did. It's what interests me is you. So this man is on trial for being who he is, not for what he did. And again, questions about Maman. There's a great little moment where he says he loves Maman the same as anyone, and the clerk, so this is the person who records what's going on in the trial, types it all up, hits the wrong key. He loses his place and has to go back. He's so shocked by what Meursault says that he loves his mother the same as anyone. Not like he puts his mother on a pedestal or she's the best lady in the world. He loves her the same as anyone. Now, if you think that makes him a psychopath or a sociopath, I want you to go, here's an assignment. I want you to go talk to as many people as you can about their mothers and find out what they have to say. I guarantee you at least one of them, and then they're not going to be a criminal, will say something that is not along the lines of, my mother is the best, most angelic person in the world. Now, that being said, my mother is wonderful. And I love her more than just anyone. I'm not saying that I'm among those people, but there are many people who have strange or bad relationships with their mothers. It doesn't make them psychopaths. And here's the moment with the crucifix. It becomes an issue of not just Meursault having the wrong reaction to his mother's death, but Meursault not going along with the societal beliefs in terms of religion. So I don't know that you would see something like this happen in contemporary American courts. I think that it would probably be stopped, although in some parts of the country I could maybe imagine something like this happening, especially in the 1940s. But here in this French court, we have an official of the court pulling out a crucifix and demanding that the person on trial admit that he believes in God and say that, God was a part of this trial and conviction. Now, this is extremely problematic, and we know this as Americans with a history of people seeking religious freedom, separation of church and state, and there have been similar issues that have unfolded in France over the years, but we know, especially as a nation with that phrase, separation of church and state, that this is problematic because a person's religious beliefs generally should have no bearing on their conviction when it comes to a crime. And yet, we know that religion is very important to people. And so if Christianity is the dominant religion and everybody who is judging you is a Christian and you're not, then whether it is said or unsaid, you have the potential to be the victim of bias. So I'm going to read this before we move on. He took out a silver crucifix, which he brandished as he came toward me. And I love how they use the word brandished, which sounds like he's holding a sword. You know, you usually brandish a sword. And in a completely different, almost cracked voice, he shouted, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "Yes, of course." Speaking very quickly and passionately, he told me that he believed in God, that it was his conviction that no man was so guilty that God would not forgive him, but in order for that to happen, a man must repent, and in doing so become like a child whose heart is open and ready to embrace all. So Meursault finds himself in a situation where if he doesn't say that he's sorry, the people who are judging him are going to believe that God will not forgive him. And that puts him in a really rough spot because he is not the kind of person to feel sorry or reflect on his actions in that way. And here is the moment with the chaplain. So the chaplain is trying to get him as well to... oh no, I'm sorry. This is not the chaplain. This is still the examining magistrate. Forgive me. So this is a continuation of the scene. The reason I chose the second part of this quote is because the chaplain cannot go outside of his own perspective and imagine that someone else could not believe in God. And he starts to have an existential crisis in that moment, openly in front of Meursault. I'm going to read from the third line. He said it was impossible. All men believed in God, even those who turned their backs on him. That was his belief, and if he were ever to doubt it, his life would become meaningless. And he says, "Do you want my life to be meaningless?" he shouted. As far as I could see, it didn't have anything to do with me, and I told him so. So, in his own little way, the examining magistrate has that realization that without God, there's meaninglessness. So he understands, in a sense, nothingness, absurdity, the existential viewpoint. But he thinks of it as a very horrible thing, while Meursault thinks of it as just the truth, not good, not bad. And Meursault, being an individualist, doesn't think it has anything to do with him, but because the examining magistrate is going with a belief that relies on many, many people agreeing, it's a societal belief, it's a group belief, it's a belief that says, we all have to experience this together. If someone else challenges that, it's like telling him that what he believes is meaningless. And that's threatening. That makes him vulnerable. And he very much does not like it. And then he tries again. He simply asked in the same weary tone if I was sorry for what I had done. I thought about it for a minute and said that I was more sorry, or that more than sorry, I felt kind of annoyed. I chose this because it's classic Meursault. It shows his reaction so well. It's not really about the overarching story. It's about the moment, and it's about his experience right now. And again, going back to that idea of it feeling surreal or like a game, um, and many things that are structured by society can feel this way if you examine them or if you feel like an outsider. He says, everything was so natural, so well handled, and so calmly acted out that I had the ridiculous impression of being one of the family. So it's like this justice system is so well planned that even the criminal feels like he has a place in it and feels like he belongs. So this kind of shows you how much Meursault is up against. He's up against something that is so well orchestrated, that is so agreed upon by everyone who's participating in it, that this system makes him feel like family, even though he's the one who's in the most danger. So you can see why people don't want to challenge these systems. You can see why people go along with these systems, even when there are parts that in reality are oppressive or inhumane or maybe just flawed in some way, because they make you feel like there's order, like things make sense, like you're a part of something. This is, what people are talking about when they talk about peer pressure. There's this kind of group mentality, this herd mentality. You feel like you're a part of something, like you're a part of a bigger system, and it makes you less likely to reject it or to challenge it. Okay, on to questions and concepts. A quick review, morality. So, who decides what rules a culture's morality? Is it the individual? Is it the group? Is it the government? It depends on the culture, I think. If you're in a dictatorship, then in some ways the dictator and the dictator's administration decides the culture's morality. But also, to what degree are other people, are the citizens, also responsible for going along with the herd or going along with what they're told? And then what is justice for all? We say that in our Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for all. How do you decide what is just if everyone has different moral beliefs? How do we make sure that everybody gets what they deserve if we don't know what they deserve? That's a very interesting and very challenging question that I'm not sure any person has one answer to. I think it's something that's a living, breathing, changing thing. Of course, religion, God, and morality show up in this chapter. And my question is, how are these related to each other or unrelated? How does religion shape your morality? Can you be moral without God? How do people develop morality for themselves if it's not around a religion or a God? Questions for you to ask yourself. And then justice. This kind of goes with liberty and justice for all. To what end is justice served? Like, who is benefiting from the justice system? And how does the system serve its people? So, do we want people in prisons? What is that doing for our society? Do we want people to be executed for their moral or immoral choices? What is this actually doing for us? Motivation. So what causes people to do what they do? And then finally, responsibility. For what are people responsible? When does responsibility end? If you're sorry, does that make you no longer responsible? These are some pretty big questions. This second half of the book hits pretty hard, even compared to the first half when it comes to big questions. All right, let's get to chapter 2. The overview is that Meursault is in prison. Sometimes he's bored, sometimes he's content, and Marie comes to visit. We'll be brief with these quotations. So Marie is visiting him at the prison. She shouts, and I quote, to me that I had to have hope. I said yes. I was looking at her as she said it, and I wanted to squeeze her shoulders through her dress. I wanted to feel the thin material, and I didn't really know what else I had to hope for other than that. So we see here Meursault's sensuality, and we also see this idea of having hope. Now, when you think that there's no meaning and there's no order to the world, then hope seems like a pretty fake thing. It's something you kind of make up for yourself, right? This is not a man who has faith. But he does, in the immediate moment, hope to be able to touch his girlfriend. That's about as far as it goes for him. He never knows what the future will hold because he doesn't expect the future to hold anything expected. We also have issues of freedom in this chapter. Of course, it's very clear we have someone who is in prison, which is in most societies the opposite of having freedom in your society and culture. So Meursault experiences this friction by having the urge to be on a beach and to walk down to the water, and then realizing that his thoughts were of a free man, but his actions could not be. He was imprisoned. And this brings me back to the justice system and prison. It's an interesting thing that we do. You know, we have this idea, maybe we want to keep criminals away from the rest of society. Maybe we want to punish them for what they've done. But imprisonment is a very interesting thing when you think about it. Like, what is it shows the values of the society. Like, what is the worst thing we can do to a person? Well, perhaps it's take their freedom away. And yet, people in most cultures, existentialists would argue, make themselves not free. They make choices that make them not free already, like choosing to follow rules or religions or various life structures. But Meursault makes it work for himself, using one of Maman's ideas, as she often repeated it, that after a while you could get used to anything. So luckily, people can be very adaptive. Apart from these annoyances, I wasn't too unhappy. Once again, the main problem was killing time. So, you know, Meursault is a pretty simple person. He doesn't have really any hobbies, it seems. He likes to go outside. He likes his freedom. So that's the one downside. But, you know, he's just trying to keep himself busy in prison. So this was a short one. We have, in Questions and Concepts, the weight of losing one's freedom, which some of you are living through. Well, all of you are living through right now to some extent. Living for sensations and experiences. And then imprisonment, literally and figuratively. So how are you imprisoned by your culture or by your mind? And how are you imprisoned literally in your ability to move through life? Or how is the character? And our last chapter in this lecture, Chapter 3, The Trial Continues. See, I told you I'd be brief. Okay, some quotations. Here we have Meursault back in outsider mode. And this is partially enforced, again, by his social situation and the fact that he is playing the role of the person who is on trial. I noticed that everyone was waving and exchanging greetings and talking, as if they were in a club where people are glad to find themselves among others from the same world. That is how I explained to myself the strange impression I had of being odd man out, a kind of intruder. And this is in the trial that is about him, which is ironic. And of course, we have the room can't be comfortable when he is on trial. No, it's getting hot, and people are waving newspapers on themselves to fan themselves. Now, this adds to the intensity of the moment, the heat, the people with making noise, this low, rumbling, rustling sound you can imagine in a movie, how they might add some sort of texture to the soundtrack to make it creepy, to add to the tension. But Camus does this with just the detail, the image, so we can make that impression and imagine that in our heads. And also, of course, things always get hot for Meursault when something is about to happen or something intense is happening in his life. His mother's funeral, the beach, and now the trial. So we have more about questioning about Maman. We're learning a little bit about their relationship. They're trying to get Meursault to admit that it had been hard on him when he let Maman go to the home, but he answers that Maman and I didn't expect anything from each other anymore, or from anyone else either, and that we had both gotten used to our new lives. So essentially, they had lost hope, but not in the sense, I mean, you could read it as how sad, but also it's sort of just a realistic loss of hope. They don't have any expectations. It's not like their expectations have been crushed. It's really just that they're not looking for something from the world or each other. So that's a nuance that's sort of telling, because it makes it less like, oh man, he's so evil to his mother, and more like, well, we just kind of had an acceptance of this is how life was. All right. So now we have questioning about the actual moment of the killing, and he asks Meursault why, the prosecutor asks Meursault why he went back to the same spot where the Arab was with a gun and was armed. And Meursault says, well, he wasn't intending to kill him. And this looks very bad, right? Why would you return to the same spot if you didn't premeditate the murder? And again, we don't really know. We can trust Meursault and his lack of sort of focus, his lack of continuity of thought, and say, well, it's really possible that this type of person did not really think about it and just happened to be there again. Or we can not trust Meursault and say, I think he may have wanted to do this. We can go with the people who are against him. And now we have the people from the funeral testifying. And so the director is being questioned. He is saying the truth, that he was surprised by Meursault's calm the day of the funeral, that he didn't cry, he hadn't wanted to see the body, etc. Oh, and he also mentions that um, he didn't know how old Maman was. Um, Now, I'm sure many of you know your parents' exact age. Um, However, once you get older and your parents get older, I guarantee you're going to start counting. And you're going to go, oh, okay, she's born 1960, so that's 10, 20, 30, 40. You know, not everybody knows. Not everybody is on top of the exact year that their parents um, were born. Well, they know what year they're born, but they don't know like, the exact year of how old they are. This is not uncommon. But it looks bad. Again, that should be a little phrase for us. It's not uncommon, but it looks bad. And they talk about the smoking and the sleeping. And in the middle of this, our very astute protagonist says, "It was then I felt a stirring go through the room, and for the first time I realized that I was guilty." So he's starting to understand that they are crafting this trial to make him guilty based on all of his actions at the funeral, towards his mother, and on the beach. He's starting to realize the way they're showing his character. The old man looked embarrassed and said, "I know it was wrong to do it, but I couldn't refuse the cigarette when Monsieur offered it to me." So he ends up blaming, in the heat of the trial, blaming Meursault for pressuring him into having a cigarette with him next to the body. You can go back and read that part, but there really isn't any indication that the old man felt pressured. So how would he have known? How would Meursault have known that it was inappropriate? And then, in a great line about the absurdity, "Here we have a perfect reflection of this entire trial. Everything is true, and nothing is true." And of course, the lawyer says this in an annoyed way, because lawyers are interested in finding the truth. That's why they do their job most often. So he likes the idea of a real truth that can be accessed. And of course, our author here is playing with a little bit of dramatic irony, because we know as the audience, and he knows as the author, that there's the possibility that there is no truth, that it's all sort of absurd, but that people create their own truth. And so that's exactly why this is a frustrating situation, because the justice system is imposing its truth on a world that it has no real truth. Celeste backs him up. He says it's bad luck that got him where he was. So that's reassuring, although most people by now are not in this camp. They don't believe that bad luck was all it is. They want a more satisfying answer than bad luck. Nobody wants to hear, "Oh, it was just bad luck." They want someone to blame. And then we have the final words of the prosecutor, which basically condemn Meursault for his character. "Gentlemen of the jury, the day after his mother's death, this man was out swimming, starting up a dubious liaison and going to the movies, a comedy for laughs. I have nothing further to say." Notice he never ever mentions the killing, the person who was killed, the beach. It's all about the day after his mother's death. And by that point, people stop listening to anything that is in his favor, in Meursault's favor. Masson testifies, Salamano testifies, nobody listens. They're all kind of tuned out because they've chosen their belief. And again, Raymond tries to say it's just chance, and the very last line of this quote, the prosecutor retorted that chance already had a lot of misdeeds on its conscience in this case. So it's like he's saying, look, chance can't be guilty here. Which we could totally laugh at. I mean, we know that chance does often, if we believe existentialists, but even, at least from my own personal experience, chance has a lot to do with the things that happen in life. And, the criminal justice system, at least in this case, is not interested in bad luck, misfortune, chance. They're interested in who can we say is guilty, who is responsible, and how do we make some sort of punishment that makes the people involved and the public feel like justice was served. So he's like, we can't put chance in jail, we can't execute chance. So I'm not really interested in chance, even though it seems like that does have something to do with this particular case. And then, wonderful, this quote, and indeed the answer is not the one that it should be, which is, come now, is my client on trial for burying his mother or for killing a man? Well, it seems he is on trial for burying his mother. Killing a man was just the catalyst to start this trial. Now we come to the end of the lecture with these questions and concepts. Chance. So chance in some ways is like the opposite of fate, right? It is the things that unfold without a plan, the things that happen without anybody controlling them. The outcomes where it's almost like life just flipped a coin and you happen to get one side. And then also subjectivity. So like, how does a person's perspective affect their life situation? I also mentioned how we use storytelling to make sense of the world. So even a trial itself is a story that we try and tell. We often tell stories about killers so we can understand why they may have done what they did. Storytelling is a huge way that we try and make sense of the world. In fact, we're doing it right now, right? We're reading this story and trying to make sense of the world based on the story. Social norms and how they mix with morality and justice. I think I've spoken enough to this, but I wanted to bring it up again. And then who has access to true justice? What kind of people are treated as outsiders or less than in this particular society, but maybe also in our own? So who does the justice system benefit? Who is it designed to help? And who is it designed to hurt, whether on purpose or not? All right. Well, that is the end of lecture. It says number 4. It's actually number 3. So that's the end of this lecture. There's one more, and then we're all done. Thank you so much to those of you who have been watching. I know that this is not the ideal way for us to engage in this. I would love to be able to respond to you and talk face to face and enjoy these quotations together. But I hope that this is helpful, and I'm looking forward to reading your responses and your personal ideas about these concepts. So, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening.